That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend.
That's Abigail Adams, writing to her husband on March 31st, 1776. John and Abigail Adams form one of the great partnerships in American history, and it's remarkable how much of their long correspondence, which began in 1762 and ended with Abigail's death in 1818, involves their mutual quest to govern their emotions.
Their relationship is so spectacular because it really is one of intellectual equals, and you can tell that they have a passion for one another, but it is grounded in this intellectual connection.
John and Abigail shared a lifelong commitment to self-improvement, based on their recognition that the cultivation of humility, in some ways the hardest virtue to achieve, requires constant work.
And there's always this desire to say, I've got it, I've figured it out. And no, I think it's never figuring it out. It's always looking. It's always searching.
Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and this is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. You just heard filmmaker Ken Burns and presidential historian Lindsay Chervinsky, author of Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. They're my guests for this third of 12 episodes, where we'll explore what the pursuit of happiness really meant to our founders and what we can learn from their daily struggles to achieve self-improvement. In this episode, we explore humility through the inspiring partnership of John and Abigail Adams.
I promised you, some time ago, a catalog of your faults, imperfections, defects, or whatever you please to call them. You could never yet be prevailed on to learn to sing. Another fault, which seems to have been obstinately persisted in, after frequent remonstrances, advices, and admonitions of your friends, is that of sitting with the legs across. Thus have I given a faithful portraiture of all the spots I have hitherto discerned in this luminary.
I thank you for your catalog, but must confess I was so hardened to read over most of my faults, with as much pleasure as an other person would have read their perfections. As to a neglect of singing, that I acknowledge to be a fault which, if possible, shall not be complained of a second time, nor should you have occasion for it now, if I had not a voice harsh as the screech of a peacock. You know, I think that a gentleman had no business to concern himself about the legs of a lady. For my part, I do not apprehend any bad effects from the practice. Yet, since you desire it, and that you may not for the future trouble yourself so much about it, will reform.
Lindsay Chervinsky, it is such an honor to welcome you to the podcast. I want to begin with the courtship of John and Abigail. When they first met, they decided to make a list of each other's faults. They'd been reading Pythagoras and decided to do self-accounting. Abigail is soft-pedaling the fact that John is the vainest man of the age, and she says, well, if you have a fault, it's that you're so brilliant, some people might think you're intellectually intimidating. And John responds, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. So it's not a great dating strategy, but they go on to one of the great, romantic and intellectual and political friendships of American history.
Well, he certainly got better at wooing her over the course of their long relationship. Even when they had been married for 30 years, he still wrote what she called quite saucy letters. And indeed, they are saucy. He makes some fun jokes in them. And I think much of the intellectual connection foundation is an interest and a commitment to lifelong learning and lifelong improvement, which requires a certain element of self-awareness, a willingness to confront one's flaws. I think that they did that well because they had a sense of humor about their flaws, which I think perhaps is essential to maintaining that commitment over the long term. But that intellectual connection that they had, that compatibility, really did stand the test of time and distance. And one of the reasons we know so much about that relationship is because they were often apart. And so therefore they wrote letters. And without those letters, we would not really have the insight we do into their incredible relationship.
You put it so well when you talk about their mutual commitment to lifelong learning and self-improvement, which of course is the classical definition of the pursuit of happiness. Where did that come from?
Adams went the traditional route initially. He was sent to school in the local community. He didn't actually thrive in that space. He really did not like education initially when he was a young boy. He wanted to be out on the farm with his father. And it wasn't until he found a teacher that could start to unlock some of that creative thinking, unlock the passion for learning, that his true intellect did show itself and he began to thrive. He did go to Harvard University, he studied law, and he worked as a teacher in between to help support himself before then starting his own law practice. But what makes him remarkable is that he didn't stop there. He continued to learn, to read, to seek out new information, whether it was experiential learning. He was quite interested in learning about new cultures and places and foods and religions and ways of life, or reading. His diaries until the end of his life will discuss his farming during the day and then what he was reading at night. And so you can see this thirst for knowledge never goes away. And when he finally wears out his eyesight, he makes his family read to him because he simply cannot be without the words.
And as a youth, he read Milton and Virgil and Voltaire and Bolingbroke. Cicero is his favorite book, and he always throughout his life returns to the Hercules choice between virtue and vice. Talk about the influence of those classical writers on his approach to living.
Well, I think these dovetail really nicely with his Puritan background. You cannot separate Abigail and John from, they were Congregationalists at the time, but they come from a long line of Puritan families. And that, what we would call today the Protestant work ethic, the drive to constantly be working and improving, was so deeply embedded in the culture and embedded in them that you couldn't separate that from their inner character. And so when you combine that foundation for who they were with a reading about humanity over the course of millennia, which is what he was doing when he was going back and looking at Cicero and Plutarch and all of these others, he was recognizing the parallels in the human condition about how things repeated time and time again, certain characteristics, certain battles, certain struggles, certain vices, but also certain truths about what humans were seeking and what they were looking for.
Talk about Abigail's education. As a woman, she wasn't allowed to attend Harvard, and yet she was a deep reader. It was inspired by one of John Adams's friends to read all sorts of authors, including Alexander Pope, and was so learned.
In some ways, I think her intellect and her brilliance is even more impressive because she didn't have the traditional forms of education. She was sickly as a young girl, so even if there were schools that were available to her, she couldn't really attend. She did have tutoring in-house. It was considered to be standard practice for young women to be taught to read, write, and do arithmetic so that you could be a good Christian and read the Bible, but also to manage your household accounts, to be a good partner to your spouse in whatever form of vocation they had. And so that was standard practice. But she really took it so much farther than that because she was a voracious reader. And to her parents' credit, they gave her access to that reading material in their home. But she continued that after her marriage, which was no small feat because she was often dealing with small children. They were not wealthy, so she did not have a lot of servants. They didn't own any enslaved individuals, so there wasn't a lot of people around them to take care of things for her. So she worked hard and yet also continued to supplement her mind. And one of the best parts of the Abigail and John correspondence is they will throw references back and forth to one another that are referencing Greek history and Roman history and literature. They could give each other as good as they got, and that demonstrates her ability to be at the same level, which I think is really remarkable.
In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest were grown discontented.
Adams graduates, he courts Abigail, and then he becomes, of course, a central figure in the American Revolution. Why is his role so central?
In a lot of ways, Adams is the stage manager of the revolution. Early on, he had a more ideological contribution, so it has been referenced a lot, Adams's defense of the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, and this was something that first demonstrates his willingness to do something that was unpopular if he believed it was right, which is a character trait that comes up time and time again in his life, but is also such an incredibly brave thing to do, and one for a very virtuous purpose, which was that he wanted to demonstrate that the resistance, that the revolution was born on principles and the rule of law and was not about mob passion. And if you are going to have a society that is built on the rule of law, you can't have it just apply to some people. And so he understood that and spoke so eloquently in their defense and indeed really won their freedom from most of the soldiers. And that is just an incredible thing to have done. He then was very active in the Continental Congresses. I believe he was on more committees than anyone else. And he was just relentless in pestering, negotiating, prodding, pushing, doing everything he could to pull the states along to be at the same place as Massachusetts, to be willing to declare independence. And where that stage manager piece comes into play was that he was instrumental in securing the nomination of the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army for George Washington. He understood that that person needed to be from the South so that it wasn't just a New England revolution, but rather a national one. And he was instrumental in getting Thomas Jefferson to write the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. And those are two of the most important things that the Continental Congresses did in their first several years.
Of all the founders, Adams is so much more pessimistic than Hamilton and Jefferson about the outsized influence of social and economic elites. And after reading Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, he understands that wealthy people will wield disproportionate political power and influence in democracies because ordinary people admire them and they want to be like them. They want to emulate them. And Adams understands that this passion for distinction to be talked about and paid attention to is the main driver of human qualities. Say more about how Adams' critique of oligarchy seems unusually prescient.
It is amazing. Those criticisms could almost have been drafted in the 21st century as we are in a moment, not the only moment, but in a moment of extreme income inequality and the concentration of political power in the hands of a wealthy few. What's interesting about Adams is, sometimes he says things that feel so out of our era. There are elements about him that are truly 18th century, but there are also elements that are incredibly prescient, as you said, and incredibly forward-thinking, and I think universal. And here is where his deep, deep reading into Cicero and all of the other ancient philosophers that he was so fond of, I think give him that timeless quality, because he understood that what Americans were experiencing in the 18th century had been experienced centuries before and were likely to be experienced centuries in the future.
In 1823, 3 years before he died, he put up a monument to his great-grandfather in Quincy, which said, "The stone and several others have been placed in the yard by a great-grandson from a veneration of the piety, humility, sympathy, prudence, patience, temperance, frugality, industry, and perseverance of his ancestors in the hope of recommending an emulation of their virtues to their posterity." So remarkable. This is a podcast about all of those classical virtues, and Adams highlighted that in his tribute to his ancestors. What does that tell us about how central those virtues were to his personal and political life?
We started the conversation talking about the importance of self-improvement, and the whole family was committed to that. One of the reasons he kept a diary for most of his life was a way to try and categorize his skills, his flaws, to document where he was making progress, where he had fallen short. And that awareness of the importance of those qualities to be a contributor to society was so essential. I think it also reflects his understanding of history, of both where he had come from, his own personal history, the role of his family in the nation, and then his awareness of his own place in history and his son's place in history and what that would look like. And in order for that history to continue to be entwined with the nation's history, I think in so many ways it's a trajectory that is very closely married. You have to have those qualities in order for the people or the nation to survive.
In 1826, Adams dies on the evening of July 4th, several hours after Jefferson's death in Monticello. He's then buried next to Abigail. As a youth, viewed as one of the most self-regarding and arrogant men of his age, and yet at the end of his life, did he achieve some of the self-awareness and humility that he thought were so central for self-mastery?
Like all humans, he was certainly imperfect, and his flaws he was never able to fully eradicate. I do think that he, at the end of his life, had a great deal of humility. His letters with Jefferson often reflect this humility in which he would say, I'm going to write more to you than you're going to write to me because you receive a lot more letters than I do, and so therefore have a lot more to respond to. And he wasn't saying it to get attention. He was genuinely just reflecting that his stature was not the same as Thomas Jefferson's. He did retain, I think, a confidence in his abilities, which I don't believe is inconsistent with humility. I think you can be keenly aware of your own strengths and also recognize your flaws, which is where I think that distinction is so important. His piety shifted over his life. He certainly moved away from what we would consider to be organized religion. He was never a deist like Jefferson, but he was more willing to be flexible in his thinking. He certainly was much more explorational in his thinking. His understanding of the people around him, his willingness to have a sense of humor about the people around him and a sense of humor about himself and his place in the world only increases with time. And so I certainly do think that he became a better version of himself towards the end of his life, which frankly, not everyone can say. So that is, I think, a real achievement.
So beautifully put. And you're so right that ultimately it is his sense of humor and self-awareness that makes him so relatable. And for all of his failings, which we all have, the fact that he was aware of them makes him an extraordinarily inspiring founder of the United States of America. Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you so much for having inspired us with the lifelong learning of John Adams.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation.
You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more worth than all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not.
Though your letters never fail to give me pleasure, be the subject what it will, yet it was greatly heightened by the prospect of the future happiness and glory of our country. Nor am I a little gratified when I reflect that a person so nearly connected with me has had the honor of being a principal actor in laying a foundation for its future greatness. May the foundation of our new Constitution be justice, truth, and righteousness. Like the wise man's house, may it be founded upon those rocks, and then neither storms or tempests will overthrow it.
When we return, Ken Burns and I reflect on the search for humility at different points in our lives. This is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Earlier in 2025, I spent 3 golden hours discussing the Founders and Virtue with filmmaker Ken Burns. We reflected on how humility can be one of the most difficult virtues to achieve. It requires us to set aside our egos so that we can tune into others and connect to the divine.
The various things that beset us are the hardest to get rid of, but humility shines a mirror, and our lawful obligation as human beings is not just to provide for our families and to make money and to have a house and to do what we're doing, but to also work on this inner architecture. And we know the density of these baser manifestations. And so this is our obligation, is to try to free ourselves from these things. And it is not an easy task. It is not a task that is achieved and, I've made it. It is an ongoing work. It requires daily kind of maintenance. That's the real rub, I think, for most people. And all of a sudden, the words that I use sound very similar to the words of civics, to the words of political science, to the words of philosophy, because they have to do with the idea of setting up within oneself a witness that can help adjudicate the thoughts, that can help temper the actions and the words so that one is more free to pursue what it is one's life calling is, whatever you're supposed to do. And I think also a word that has not come into our conversation so far, but I think is central to all of this, is love. It is so important. It's so tough, as we are taught in every discipline, to love your enemy, to love the other as yourself, to do unto others as you would hope they would be done unto you. And we experience it in love of the children, and love of a partner, and love of a country. You know, I live in New Hampshire. It's a very political state. And we always have elections every couple of years. And then, of course, every 4 years for the presidency, everybody's lawns are filled with signs. I have one sign that is up 365 days a year, every year. And it says, love multiplies, which is the only equation that I think is actually the only thing that I know is absolutely true. Like, I know that sometimes great art does that, great music does that, love does that. But love multiplying, that's something that I'm attracted to, the possibilities of what it suggests, the cosmic as well as practical possibilities.
This is so central. The thing to be overcome is egotism, or as the founders called it, self-love.
Right.
And the goal is love of others. It's really hard to cultivate. Humility is the toughest, as Franklin said. I'll share that I was so full of arrogance as a kid and self-love, and what really helped me was a career crisis, and just getting hit over the head, messing up, getting rightly criticized, helped me realize I'm not perfect. I'm not God. It's okay if people criticize me for messing up. That was the beginning of the path. But as you say, it's a daily thing, and it's very, very hard to cultivate.
Absolutely. It seems paradoxical because we look at power as a sort of end-all and be-all. In fact, it's one of the corrupting cul-de-sacs that we find ourselves in. I'm in charge of an enterprise, but I wash the dishes because I need to remind myself that I can do every job. It also sets an example for others. Paul McCartney said the love you take is equal to the love you make. That is an equation that is so completely right, and we see the way in which we don't choose that. I have, over the years, struggled myself. I lost my mother when I was 11, and there was never a moment when I was growing up when she wasn't dying. So that hung over me. I had no real childhood, or one that was beset by a sort of Damocles that was just about to drop, and it did just before my 12th birthday. And I then went into a period of sort of denial, where I just lived a fairly kind of life, but behind it was unexamined questions. And it really took to my late 30s to begin to realize, like your professional crisis that you described, that I couldn't run away from this anymore. The date of her death, April 28th, would be ahead and then behind. I was never present at the time. And finally, a personal crisis forced me to go and deal with it. And it has made me so much lighter. It made me a better father, I think. I engaged my then oldest daughters in the act of my own healing. And we found a place where that we could find my mother and have a burial and have a plaque and memorialize it. And for many years, the whole day was spent in memorial. And now we would go back to the place where she had died and be there. Now we don't have to do it, but every day, even my younger daughters who were not alive during this crisis are very much part and parcel. And whenever 428 comes up in a game or in the afternoon or even the morning, they'll say, "Mommy, Mama." I called my mother Mommy. They call their mother Mama. And so we keep a spirit alive. And it's all about lightening the load. It's all about figuring out a way to translate the dramas and the egotism and into something that is much more productive. I had a friend in crisis yesterday, and I said, "Do you know the three things? Have I ever told you the three things?" Something that I had needed back in that crisis, 30 years ago, and what I've communicated to my daughters at times of need and to other friends. I've had friends come up and pull out a Post-it that I wrote for them and said, "It's still working." And that is very simple. This won't last. Get help from others. Be kind to yourself. The last one's the hardest one of all. But it could get worse, but things are always changing. That's the nature of the universe. So whatever the situation is, will have an ultimate impermanence to it. And that is something that you can count on. The state that I'm in, the sadness I'm in, the anxiety that I'm in, the euphoria that I'm in, if that's a dangerous euphoria, is not going to last. That it's really important to be connected to other people, that the tendency in problem is to withdraw, and that to be connected to other people is to offer a lifeline and hear the familiarity that there's nothing really quite special of yours, and that there is a familiarity and a specificity to the sadnesses that people experience. And that gives us the ability to help not only repair ourselves, but to repair the other, which is the great gift. Get help from others, and then be kind to yourself, which is the hardest of all to do. We don't want this unpleasant manifestation, and so we actually, like those finger traps, we pull and pull and pull, and they get tighter and tighter and tighter. And we have to actually learn that the way the trap ceases is by relaxing and moving into it. And that's so difficult, still difficult to learn. I still have a temper. Don't show it to other people, but I can get, and it's an impatience. And I'm really struggling, Jeff, to do this. When this morning I'm in the dark and I'm tired, I didn't get much sleep, and I'm making breakfast for my daughter who's still asleep, and I drop an expensive egg. Now that eggs are, up to Fabergé price these days, and it goes on the floor, and I'm like, swear, and I realize, egg didn't do that. I dropped the egg, and it was as if there was some outer unfairness that had taken place. And that's, you just see, I'm 71 years old. I like my work. I like the people I work with. I've been a good dad. I could be better. I'm blessed in many ways, and yet I see this mountain, this Everest of work ahead, and it does not, I was going to say faze me. Of course it fazes me. It's Everest. It should faze me, but it is not a burden. It is the path, the only path to take.
The story of John and Abigail Adams reminds us that cultivating humility is a lifelong struggle. Adams' hypersensitivity to being disrespected and unappreciated led to famous political fallings out with his close friends and revolutionary associates, Thomas Jefferson and Mercy Otis Warren. But what makes Adams so human and ultimately so relatable is that he overcame his vanity and wounded pride sufficiently to reconcile with both Warren and Jefferson. Adams worked throughout his long life to subdue his vanity and ambition in order to achieve the tranquility of soul that he learned from Cicero was the secret of happiness. And Abigail was with him on the journey every step of the way.
I hope soon to see you. Meantime, write as often as possible to yours, John Adams.
Your desire that I would write with every opportunity is punctually observed by me, and I comply with your request, although I have nothing more to say than, how do ye, and when will you return? These questions perhaps may appear trifling to others, yet to me they are matters of the highest importance.
The song I wrote about humility is called Judge Not. It's a reflection on some advice from the Bible. Judge not, lest ye be judged, that John was fond of sharing with Abigail, although he had trouble practicing it himself. Here's Jennifer Blythe on the piano and baritone James Martin.
When you judge, your mind gets all distracted. You're just not focused on your rhythm and rhyme. When you judge the way someone else has acted, you're giving yourself a pass for wasting time. Judge not and avoid distractions. Judge not and keep your focus clear. Judge not, control your thoughts and actions so they're totally focused on the now and here. When you judge, your mind races with turbulent emotions like anger and jealousy, haughtiness and fear. Instead of tearing someone down, lift up yourself with your devotions and still your mind like the waters clear. Judge not and conserve your energies. Judge not and purify your mind. Judge not, be still the waters. Judge not and access the divine. Instead of judging others for heaven or damnation, ask yourself how you're using every minute of the day. Are you avoiding facing up to your own procrastination? Well, get to work. It's the only way. Judge not if your anxiety's mounting. Judge not, it's time to greet the dawn. Judge not, it's time for self-accounting. And now I've finished my Judge Not song.
Thanks for listening, friends. I'm thrilled that my new book is out in October 2025. It's called The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Please order online or check it out at a bookstore near you. Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness, is produced by PRX Productions for the National Constitution Center. From PRX, the team is Genevieve Sponsler, Courtney Florentine, David Newtown, and Sandra Lopez Monsalve. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. From the NCC, our team is Annie Stone, Griffin Ritchie, and Bill Pollack. Music and lyrics by Jeffrey Rosen, with arrangements by Greg Stroman. The songs and incidental music feature baritone James Martin, with Jennifer Blythe at the piano and Greg Stroman on trombone for the theme song. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. In our next episode, I'm joined by Eric Slaughter. We'll explore what Thomas Jefferson's reading list means today. This podcast was made possible with the support of the John Templeton Foundation.